introduce Professor Amanda Adler to join me for a conversation reflecting on Estimands and their use from the clinical perspective. So Amanda's a key player in the world of clinical trials, so I'm really delighted she's here to talk to us. So she's a Professor of Diabetic Medicine and Health Policy at Oxford University, where she also directs the Diabetes Trials Unit. And she also has a key role at NICE, National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, evaluating drugs and other medical technologies for wide use across the NHS. And she's also a practicing NHS consultant. So welcome, Amanda.
Thank you so much.
Brilliant. So to kick off our conversation, it would be great if you could give us a little introduction to what initially brought you into working in the world of clinical trials and your background in clinical trials.
Well, I guess I, as a Californian, was impressed with David Eddy, a great man in American medicine who, at least apocryphally, was working as a surgeon at Stanford University and asked the question, how do we know if what we're doing actually works? Mm-hmm. So he walked across the street to the engineering school to get a framework for doing things in a systematized trial sort of way. And then having moved from the West Coast to the United Kingdom, I was thrilled to be living in a country that had the insight to provide healthcare. But as I explained to my family in America, the British only want to pay for stuff that actually works. And so they have to have a means of proving that. So I guess that's my background in clinical trials. And then as a NICE Technology Appraisal Committee chair for many years, we certainly made policy on the basis of trials.
Brilliant. Well, we're delighted that we have you over here in the UK working on our trials with us. So well, we're all here today to talk about Estimands in trials today. So I'd like to ask you if you can recall when you first heard the word Estimand pop up, what were your initial thoughts about them?
So I first heard the word when, having been introduced to the ICH, the International Conference on Harmonization Statistical Guidelines, which I had read when trying to figure out and get my head around the trials, the big cardiovascular non-inferiority safety trials we were doing in diabetes. I was intrigued that this document seemed to have been developed in the 1990s and then kind of nothing added until, of course, a couple of years ago when I saw this Estimands stuff. So I read it. I didn't quite understand it. I'm still getting my head around it, but I also imagined that it would be a challenge to explain to patients why 20 years into this document, and only at this point where we're concerned about the clarity of the questions we were asking. So that's how I was introduced to it. And so I have appreciated that it's about intercurrent events. It was always a challenge to explain to colleagues and patients why one would do an intention to treat analysis to see how well a drug worked in people who didn't even necessarily ever take it. So it certainly gets to some important areas.
Great. Well, as we have already heard this morning, Estimands are all about being clear about precisely what we want to find out in a trial to address a specific question. So an Estimand is really a precise description of a treatment effect that's to be estimated in a trial. So it essentially just describes in words what the numerical result at the end of the trial that we'll produce. So I just wanted to ask, what are your current feelings and thoughts on using Estimands in trials today? Now, how do you think we should be using them when we design our trials?
Well, if it's all about clarity, I guess I will find the challenge of explaining to patients what we've been doing up to this point, if things have been utterly unclear, if you will. I think, as many people do, the word estimand, estimator, and estimate are pretty confusing. I have figured out that the estimand is, if you will, what people demand. The estimate is what you calculate, and the estimator is what's chosen by the investigator. But I think we actually need a fourth one. I think we need esti question. So I don't think any of these things are relevant unless they're accompanied explicitly by what question is being asked. So I guess that gets at the clarity. So we can certainly use these in clinical trials. We've heard about diabetes, but in diabetes, the trials are years long because the complications take years to develop. And so that an intercurrent event would occur is increasingly likely. In diabetes, unlike cancer, where you take a drug until the point where the disease progresses, in diabetes, disease progresses, but we seem to just sort of pile in treatments. But at some point, people stop them. And so that's a classic example of an intercurrent event. I think it'll be interesting to see about estimators in device trials. Not only diabetes, but other disease areas are increasingly device-driven, be it an insulin pump or the meter that people wear on their arms to check their blood glucose. And that inspires an intercurrent event and inspires treatment changes. So I think, we'll be seeing these in diabetes trials and all trials.
Excellent. Well, I really have to say, I really like your term ESTI question. I think that there are quite a lot of technicalities to Estimands, but sort of, maybe having a nice overall summary as well, framed in that way, would be very helpful. And this, after the break, I am going to be going more into Estimands, estimates and estimators. So again, to anyone listening, if you're still not quite sure, we'll be covering that more in a little bit. Brilliant. Well, you have touched on some advantages there of having Estimands. I wondered if maybe you see any disadvantages of having Estimands at all.
Well, I think the advantage is that you can ask so many questions. And I think the disadvantage is that you can ask so many questions. So people will wonder ultimately what is the most important question. And trialists may wonder which of these questions do you power the study too. I noted Stephen Julius was on this call. I bet he's thinking about that. But I think there'll be lots of questions, but different groups will make decisions on different questions. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We already know that regulators and payers make decisions on perhaps different questions, and patients and doctors make different decisions based on different questions. So a fundamental question in medicine and indeed in life is don't ask any question unless you're going to know what you're going to do with the answer. So I think that's something else we have to think about.
Agree. Yeah, lots of new things to think about, which really actually are just different ways of thinking about what we have already done and just bringing things to the surface and making things a lot more transparent. Excellent. And so, well, one of the things that Estimands are key about is about making more transparent is being clear on how we're handling those post-randomization events, such as treatment non-adherence or treatment arm switching, because these are the events that do affect the interpretation of patient outcomes. And these events are nothing new, and they have always occurred. So they've just been given this new label of intercurrent events and form part of the Estimand. I wanted to ask you, sort of in the trials that you have been involved in or have evaluated results of, have you seen a lot of post-randomization events occurring? And do you think transparency on how these are handled will be important?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Again, take diabetes. One of the most effective treatments for diabetes are very low-calorie diets. And if you think people can stick on those for even the duration of the trial, let alone life, it's so yes, we absolutely see intercurrent events. We see treatment switching. At NICE, what is not an intercurrent event to the trialist is actually, if you will, a de facto intercurrent event to decision makers, because NICE asks the question whether a new treatment makes people live longer or better. And we've been presented with cancer trials where treatment switching at disease progression, when technically the trial is over, occurs. But it, of course, is an intercurrent event to the payer because it occurs before the endpoint of how long people live. So whether Estimands will address that kind of challenge, I don't know.
Yeah, I think Estimand, they will have utility in longer follow-up studies as well. So hopefully they will help in that respect. Brilliant. So, well, as we sort of kind of are all familiar with, trials have traditionally adopted an intention to treat approach analysis, where the data of all randomized patients is included, regardless of what happens to them later on in the trial. So regardless of whether, for example, they did switch treatment or something else. And so this is what the addendum clarifies as the treatment policy strategy, where we're looking at the treatment effect despite the occurrence of these. But as we've already heard this morning, the framework does provide a basis for discussing other types of treatment effects. So, for example, the treatment effect, if everybody adhered to treatment, as we just heard from Finzar, was of interest in the Pioneer trials. I wanted to ask you what opportunities you see this can bring. Do you think you would like to know other treatment effects in some trials that go beyond the traditional treatment policy intention to treat approach?
Yes, and we have to, again, figure out what question we're asking and for whom. So patients want to know sort of how that diet works on average, if you will, and not for the people who can, only the rare people who can stick to it. As a clinical diabetologist, I thought those diabetes regression diets, there was a risk factor for being able to stay on them, and that was either being an engineer or being a military person. Anyway, I think it was, yes, there are importance, but scientists may need to know how things work mechanistically. So they really may need to understand how it works for people who actually take it. I think there's some real challenges to getting one's heads around it. So Brendan, for example, talked about the while alive strategy. Now, I don't know how I would explain why it was important to have an other than while alive strategy. And even the ICH document bemoaned missing data on the size of a diabetic foot ulcer if you had, say, the patient had undergone an amputation. So some of these things need further clarity, and they need to make sense to everybody involved.
No, I completely agree. I think we're just really on the beginning of the Estimand journey, and there's lots to be thought through. Because although Estimands have been around for a couple of years now, they're sort of not really yet universally being used, because the addendum did come out in November 2019, and this is what introduced all the language and the framework. I wanted to ask why you think Estimands aren't quite yet universally being used.
Well, I suspect at the point that the regulators require them, they will be universally used by those hoping to get marketing authorizations. I think we need to understand them more before we use them, and we need to know what we're going to do on the basis of the question. So we're going to ask these questions, we're going to get answers, but then we have to decide what to do with them. And I do think it's sort of hard to understand, and the similarities of the wording. Also, I'm slightly wondering how, I love the PICO framework. It seems to be one that population intervention, comparison, and outcome, it's very straightforward. So is this framework going to replace that insofar as 3 of the 5 elements seem to be in, or can we just add intercurrent events onto PICO, say? That would be my preference.
Yeah, no, that is a good point, because there is some overlap between them. But yeah, the key difference is really the intercurrent events, because they haven't appeared before. So I think that's what really brings Estimand to the forefront, but also thinking also about the summary measure that you're using to assess your results with. So there might be that there's some, I don't know, there is some work sort of needed to think how they align together. Do agree. Brilliant. So, well, as we know, the addendum, it did come as an addendum to ICHE 9, which is the international guideline for statistical principles for clinical trials. I wanted to ask you who you think Estimands are for. Do you think they're just for statisticians, or should they be of interest to other stakeholders?
I think they should be primarily for the people most likely to benefit. Call them patients or people. So that's who I think they're primarily for. But of course, they're also for scientists who need to understand mechanisms. They're for payers to determine whether new treatments are effective and reflect good value for money, importantly against what we already offer. And what is lacking a little bit in this conversation today, I think, is the continuing importance of the comparator. But I know Oliver Keane and the his paper that he with colleagues wrote about Estimands said that, quote, practicing physicians remain largely disconnected from this Estimand concept. And I think that hasn't changed at this point. Some of my rather prominent, extremely intelligent colleagues around this country said, no, I don't actually understand what an Estimand is. And I said, well, come to this session then.
Yeah, we've definitely got a lot more work to do to sort of really raise the profile of Estimands. Brilliant. So, well, we've talked a lot about using Estimands in trial design and ensuring we get answer the questions of interest. And we really have got an opportunity to make sure we can now answer the questions of interest to everyone. I wanted to ask you now about Estimands in like published trial reports. Have you seen any Estimands being reported in any journal publications yet at all?
Yes, I have. As we've heard today, Novo Nordisk, in developing their drug semaglutide, has explicitly discussed two Estimands, and so that was related to weight loss. So I have seen that.
Excellent. Would you like to see more Estimands in trial reports? Do you think they're helpful to see at the publication stage?
Well, I wouldn't simply like to see the Estimands, but I want to see a really clear explanation of why they chose what they did, what they're going to do with the answer, and acknowledging that these are sort of new. I think it's authors ought to explain what it is, but I think they don't, because I think they may not be entirely sure themselves.
Yeah, no, I like having the Estimand. Also, the rationale is very important. So I know that one of your roles has been chairing a technology appraisal committee at NICE. Wanted to ask whether you've come across Estimands in the work you've done with NICE, and or would Estimands facilitate the work you do with NICE?
Well, the good news is I know that NICE has explicitly sought to understand and incorporate Estimands, and even just last week had a large internal meeting about that. I have not seen Estimands personally. I'm aware that the Novo Nordisk drugs have gone through NICE, and whether Estimands were part of the manufacturer submission should be available insofar as NICE continues to do an excellent job on transparency. We have certainly had to deal with intercurrent events at NICE. Again, the treatment switching, the regulators for cancer drugs accept progression-free survival as an endpoint, but NICE wants to know how much longer we live. So how Estimands will replace or interface with these sort of methods that we currently use, inverse probability of censoring weighting. These crossovers tend to decrease the effectiveness of effectiveness drugs. So it's important to correct for them. So we'll look forward to seeing how those methods might interface.
Brilliant. Well, it's fantastic to hear that Estimands are on NICE radar. And I think that's very useful for us all here to know today. And hopefully Estimands will only help complement the analysis and the results that NICE see, because they'll be there helping to make it precisely clear exactly what estimates these methods are giving. So hopefully they'll just be an added complement. Brilliant. So this leads me to my last question to ask you now, actually. I just wanted to ask whether you've got any thoughts on how we can increase the uptake of use of Estimands in trials so that we get trials that answer clear and useful questions. I don't know whether you have any thoughts on how we, the trials community, can help increase and support the use of Estimands.
I think mornings like today and tomorrow are certainly a start. I think we need to put this Estimand concept into the importance of it in ways people can understand. I know you have some creative metaphors to use, but I think above all, we have to include explicitly the questions we're trying to answer and ask of them, so what? Why do we need these answers? And so it's almost modeling your decision beyond the end of the trial itself. What then will happen? Who will do what with this Estimand? So it's interesting.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And yeah, we have got some metaphors coming up after the break. So I look forward to sharing with them now. So I think that does actually bring us nicely to time for the end of this session and time for a short break now. So I'd just like to say a big thank you, Amanda, for joining us and offering your clinical perspectives, because it's been really interesting to hear. And thank you to all our other speakers this morning.
It's my pleasure. Maybe we can do this over a beer in future. I see all the interesting questions. And so thank you, Susie.